This cemetery and the church right over there are located on land owned by the first and one of the largest landholders of today's Flat Rock, Abraham Kuykendall. Later, land was given to the church by the King family and Charles Baring to add a little bit of land that the church owns. The old log church stood near the large green boxwood that was sitting in the middle of the cemetery a few years ago. You might see a large green boxwood. Anyway, there was a large green boxwood sitting sort of in the middle of the cemetery. And that's where the original log church was. There's a slave section. Problem is, because the slave section had old unmarked field stones, when they start maintaining these church cemeteries a lot of time, because they don't understand historical preservation, they remove the old field stones. The absolute worst possible thing they could do. Don't ever remove old field stones. And it was back in that section on the edge down in the woods. Early slaves came to church at Mud Creek with slave owners. And early records indicate that other slaves are also buried in the cemetery that belonged to the Charlestonians that started moving into Flat Rock. In fact, Mud Creek Baptist Church had to distribute a letter to these Charlestonian plantation owners requesting that they quit leaving the dead bodies of their slaves on the church property. So we know some of those slaves are also buried in this cemetery. Remnants of the old wagon road, sometimes called the old Saluda Trail, the old State Road, or Buncombe Turnpike, can be seen behind the wooded borders of the cemetery. It's actually a little dirt trail. You can kind of see it cleared out back in that section on the other side of those woods. So when I tell you the old Saluda Trail and old Buncombe Turnpike, when I say it kind of runs parallel, I literally mean parallel. You know, it kind of comes up this way and goes down. It's not where the Greenville Highway is today. It kind of runs parallel with it. But remnants of that old road are down there.
And it was still in use when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Used to be a paper.
It's not the
Yeah,
road
back in
right there, is it?
1890, I
Yes,
used
that
to
little
park.
road, it's a little dirt road.
That's it.
Okay, YouTube.
The turnpike went behind St. John in the Wilderness Episcopal Church and comes out kind of near today. It kind of comes down near today's Irkwood Drive down in here. Mud Creek Baptist Church was the third Baptist church established in Henderson County. It was established in 1803 or 1804. As far as being organized, it's a whole lot older than St. John in the Wilderness. A lot older. St. John in the Wilderness is nowhere near as historical as many other churches that we've talked about or will be talking about for those who hadn't taken the class yet or just started. Members of the French Broad Baptist Church that we did on the last tour, they started this church. There have been 4 different buildings housing the church congregation since 1804. This early log structure was torn down and another church was built over there in that parking lot, and that was another log building. This building was torn down, that one was torn down in 1895 because it was considered unsafe. A white frame building was erected about 1900. In 1963, a brick church building was erected where the church now sits over there. The new sanctuary of this church was completed in 1995. There is a rock monument in the garden over there at the church that portrays with images of the 4 buildings that housed this congregation beginning in 1803. And the sketches of those churches are etched into that granite stone over there. Now I want to tell you about some of the folks buried in here. Abraham Kuykendall's grave is right down here. And we discuss him as being a Revolutionary War veteran. His family was originally Dutch. A whole lot of people right here descend from him. They came in originally to New Amsterdam. They were traders and they were frontiersmen. And as the populations became more settled, like in Albany and places, they kept moving more into the wilderness. Eventually, they ended up being some of the very, very first people to move into what is now West Virginia. Then the family moved down. He and his brother moved down into Old Rutherford County. We call it Old Rutherford County. And he was one of the first people there active in the government, was in charge of building the courthouse and the jail in Rutherford County. And by the time the Revolutionary War started, he was an old man. So he didn't actually fight in the war. People get that very confused. He was too old. He was on the Committee of Safety, which means he was on the committee for Rutherford and originally Old Tryon County and then Rutherford County for governing during the Revolution. He definitely was a patriot, and he was a member of the state government, I guess you would call it, during the Revolution. And that is noted on his tombstone over here. There, that's a DAR monument. He got a land grant for that, but it was in Tennessee. And he and his brother moved from Rutherford County to Tennessee not long after the Revolutionary War, I would say late 1780s. By 1790, he decided he wanted to come back to this area. He sold that land in East Tennessee, and he bought what is now almost all of Flat Rock. He had a sawmill, which we think is located at the Argyle property. They think, they're not 100% sure about that. He also had a grist mill and a tavern or inn that was located, we're not exactly sure where, but not far from this church and cemetery. Drovers and travelers would stop at the tavern and inn he built on the early road, which was the early Saluda Trail or Old Buncombe Turnpike. He made his whiskey from a still house located on his property that he served at the tavern. Legend states he buried his silver and gold in a large wash pot somewhere on the property. 2 of his slaves dug the hole, but they were led to the spot blindfolded. Kuykendall died before disclosing the location of where he buried his money. And for more than 200 years, treasure seekers still search for his buried pot of gold and silver. His ghost supposedly haunts the Little River Road area near Pheasant Branch, where he's out looking for his gold all the time. Now, Abraham Kuykendall had a lot of children. Some of the guys some of them never even moved into this area. They stayed in Rutherford County or moved to Georgia or South Carolina and other places like that. And a lot of them did. Some did move into this area. And I didn't jot down all the different kids and who they married and all this. I will tell you, one of them married a McMinn. One of them married a Stepp. One of them married a Shipman. One of them married Edmund McGuffey, who later, their daughter married one of their Joneses. So almost all the Joneses in the county descend from Abraham Kuykendall. So there's a whole lot of different kids in there. And he was very old, so these children were grown by the time the Revolutionary War started. Some of them were. So they had a lot of kids. So you can imagine the hundreds and thousands of descendants in the county that descend from Abraham Kuykendall. Another important figure buried here is James Dyer Justice. That's Justice. He descends from that family that originally settled Jamestown, were the very important surveyors in Old Rutherford County, and then started moving up into this area. He was one of the first surveyors in 1841 to survey the land that was to become the city of Hendersonville. He laid out the streets and divided the acreage into lots. Therefore, Justice Street in Hendersonville is named for James Dyer Justice in this cemetery. Justice married Anthright Thomas, the daughter of John Thomas, who owned many acres of land in today's DuPont State Forest, Crab Creek, and Etowah communities. The grave of Anthright Thomas Justice is the oldest marked grave in this cemetery. There are 4 men who died in World War II, local guys who died in World War II buried in this cemetery. Charles William Anders, who was killed in action in Italy during the Volturno Line Offensive in the invasion of Italy. Edward Otto Capps, who was killed in action during battles at Guadalcanal. Joseph Pinckney Hollingsworth Jr., who died in a non-battle death during training in the Army Air Corps here in the United States. And George Elbert Jackson, a sailor who was home on leave and died in a car accident while he was on leave. One man who died in World War I is buried here, Robert Roy Kuykendall, who died of the flu epidemic in 1918 at Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina. There are 3 men who served in the Spanish-American War or the Philippine-American War buried here, and our only guy in those wars that was actually killed in action is buried here, and that is Thomas W. Hollingsworth. He was killed in action during fighting in the Philippines. The other 2 veterans of that war, Edward Leonard Drake and William Freeman Thomas. We have here buried a representative to the General Assembly, John P. Patton, who was a merchant. He was chairman of the County Board of Education for many, many years and postmaster in Flat Rock in addition to being in our legislature. We have a town marshal here, John Lafayette Orr, who served in 1887 as the Hendersonville town marshal. We have 11 men who served in the Confederate Army buried here. Lindsay Baker Anders, Sam's ancestor, Peter Anders, Merritt R. Capps, David B. Giles, Samuel N. Hardin, Isaac Alexander Hollingsworth, Thomas Coleman Hollingsworth, John Allen Kuykendall, John D. Nelson, Minor Clinton Redden, and Alexander H. Tabor. So you can see why this is would be considered one of the top 5, I would say, maybe top 3 or 2 most historic cemeteries in all of Henderson County. So if you would like to walk through and take photos.
The old church.
Yeah.
Where is Jennie's diary?
There.
I'd have to search for it, and I didn't bring my cemetery book to give you the exact road.
They don't charge much belt that.
Yeah, that's his right there.
That's hers?
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go down here. Depending on how you come out of this parking lot, you want to turn right. Okay? And I have on your sheet about the approximate 1/10 of a mile to where you're gonna see Mountain Lodge off in the distance on the right. The Mountain Lodge Estate, that's the Charles and Susan Baring Estate, which is the corner of Trenholm and Rutledge on your right. If any of you want to turn on Trenholm and pull off the side of the road and take a picture, you're going to be able to get a better view and a better picture off Trenholm. Does that make any sense?
Sure.
So if you make that right turn on Trenholm, you actually kind of see the house better than you do from Rutledge. But we're not going to turn right on Trenholm. But if any of you want to do that, we'll wait on you at St. John. If you just continue on Rutledge, it's going to take you to St. John in the Wilderness. You turn into the parking lot on the left, and that's where we're going next. If you have walking difficulties, the parking lot at St. John in the Wilderness, you've got to walk up a hill to get to the church and the cemetery. They prefer us parking in the parking lot, but those of you who cannot walk well up that hill, feel free to drive up closer to the church and pull off on the side of the road, okay? And you'll be right there at the church, and it's a lot easier walk in there. You can go inside, the church will be unlocked, and we will meet in front of the church when we get there. So if any of you want to, remember Mountain Lodge is not the oldest Charlestonian home in Flat Rock. Actually, Argyle, the original structure within Argyle, was built by local folks before Mitchell King bought the property and built Argyle around a local family's home. So Argyle is actually older. Some of the parts of Argyle are older than Mountain Lodge, but Mountain Lodge would be the next oldest home of the Charlestonians. Okay.
Who lived in the original? You know?
Thomas Justice sold it to him, and a Cagle sold it to him, but he